Angola's last communist leader, José Eduardo dos Santos, ruled for nearly 4 decades, from civil war to peacetime oil boom. Backed by Soviet and Cuban support, his MPLA government fought a 26-year brutal civil war against the US and Chinese-backed UNITA rebels. Even after the Cold War ended and communism collapsed elsewhere, dos Santos held on. In 1992, the country quietly dropped Marxism-Leninism from its constitution, but dos Santos didn't leave office. He simply adapted. He rebranded himself, opened the economy, and ruled until 2017, accused of massive corruption and quietly channeling Angola's oil wealth to his family. When Parliament banned the president from holding business interests, he handed the reins to his daughter instead. He died in 2022, but the strongman's legacy and fortune lives on. Benin's last communist leader, Mathieu Kérékou, was a military officer who declared Marxism-Leninism by decree in 1974. Backed by more slogans than structure, his regime modelled itself on the Eastern Bloc, minus the industry. But by the late 1980s, Benin was bankrupt and communism was collapsing worldwide. Its debt had nearly doubled in 5 years, the economy had shrunk by over 25%, and by 1989, the regime was forced into a $22 million IMF bailout just to stay afloat. In 1989, Kérékou dropped Marxism entirely, and by 1991, he shockingly agreed to multi-party elections and lost. But that wasn't the end. In 1996, he made a comeback, this time as a born-again Christian, winning re-election and ruling until 2006. From Marx to Jesus, few communist leaders pivoted that hard. Kérékou later died in 2015. Thomas Sankara ruled Burkina Faso for just 4 years, but what he lacked in time, he made up for in revolution. Taking power in a 1983 coup at just 33, he launched a radical program of land reform, nationalization, and anti-imperialism. He banned forced marriages, taxed the rich, planted millions of trees, and renamed the country from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, the land of upright people. Sankara leaned heavily into Marxist and Pan-Africanist ideals, drawing support from Cuba and Libya, though the country was never formally declared communist. Still, many scholars classify his regime as revolutionary socialist, if not fully Marxist-Leninist. In 1987, he was assassinated in a coup led by his former ally, Blaise Compaoré, ending one of Africa's boldest experiments in leftist rule before it could fully take shape. Comoros never went full communist, but under Ali Souali, it gave revolution a try. After independence from France in 1975, Souali seized power and launched a radical transformation: land reform, youth militias, and a push for a secular, self-reliant socialism. He banned religious schools, mocked tradition, and flirted with Maoist-style rhetoric, more anti-colonial than Marxist, but still red enough to worry the West. In 1978, French-backed mercenaries stormed the islands, killed Souali, and restored conservative rule. Comoros' social experiment barely lasted 3 years. Denis Sassou Nguesso, once a loyal Marxist-Leninist and ally of the USSR, became Congo's last communist leader and one of Africa's longest ruling. When the Republic of the Congo declared itself Africa's first officially Marxist state in 1969, it set the stage for decades of one-party rule. Sassou took power in 1979 and presided over a tightly controlled system built on socialist slogans and Soviet support. But when the Cold War ended, so did the ideology. In 1992, he stepped down after losing multi-party elections, a rare act for a Cold War-era strongman. But Sassou wasn't done. He returned to power in 1997 following a civil war and has ruled ever since. No longer a communist, just a president for life with better PR. Ethiopia's last communist ruler, Mengistu Haile Mariam, came to power after a bloody coup and revolution that overthrew the monarchy in 1974. His regime, known as the Derg, turned Ethiopia into a Soviet-backed Marxist state, nationalized everything, and in 1976 unleashed the Red Terror, a brutal purge that killed anywhere from 10,000 to 1 million people, many on Mengistu's direct orders. Backed by Cuban troops and Soviet arms, he clung to power through famine, war, and rebellion, even from rival communist factions that wanted him dead. Like other authoritarian regimes of the era, the Derg built a secret police, spied on its own people, and silenced dissent through torture and execution. But in 1991, as the USSR collapsed, so did Mengistu. He fled to Zimbabwe just before rebels took the capital, never to face justice. Convicted of genocide in absentia, he lives in quiet exile to this day, unrepentant. Historians estimate he was responsible for the deaths of between 500,000 and 2 million Ethiopians. João Bernardo Vieira, known as Nino, was Guinea-Bissau's last communist leader, though, in truth, his rule mixed Marxist slogans with military pragmatism. He came to power in 1980 through a coup and aligned the country with Cuba and the USSR, pushing socialist policies in name more than practice though. By 1991, with the Cold War over, socialism was dropped and multi-party politics were introduced. Vieira hung on through the transition, but his rule grew increasingly authoritarian. In 1999, he was overthrown. In 2005, he came back, only to be assassinated in 2009 by soldiers seeking revenge. Didier Ratsiraka, Madagascar's self-styled Red Admiral, seized power in 1975 and declared a socialist revolution, backed by North Korea and the Soviets. He nationalized industries, isolated the country, and imposed tight state control, turning the island into a quirky, hardline Marxist state. But by the early 90s, the economy was in freefall and the Cold War was over. In 1991, socialism was dropped from the constitution, and Ratsiraka was forced to accept democratic reforms. He lost power in 1993, only to return in 1997, rebranded. Eventually ousted again in 2002, he was sent into exile soon after following a political crisis, and was sentenced in absentia to 10 years of hard labor in Madagascar after being accused of stealing nearly $8 million. He later returned to Madagascar though, and died in 2021. Mozambique's last communist leader, Joaquim Chissano, inherited a war-torn state in 1986 after the death of the country's first president, Samora Machel. The ruling Frelimo party had embraced Marxist-Leninism, but the country was collapsing under pressure from civil war, economic ruin, and Cold War isolation. Chissano saw the writing on the wall. By 1990, Mozambique had dropped socialism from its constitution, and 2 years later, he signed a peace deal with anti-communist Renamo rebels. But, unlike many of his peers, Chissano didn't fall, he transitioned. He led a democratic government for another decade, eventually stepping down voluntarily in 2005. Somalia's communist chapter began in 1970 when General Siad Barre declared the country a Marxist-Leninist state after seizing power in a military coup. With Soviet and Cuban backing, he nationalized land and industry, launched sweeping literacy campaigns, and created a one-party state under the banner of scientific socialism. But behind the slogans was a ruthless dictatorship. Dissidents were tortured, clans were crushed, and a secret police force kept tabs on the population, much like in Ethiopia. In 1977, though, Barre invaded Ethiopia's Ogaden region, expecting Soviet support. But Moscow backed Ethiopia instead, and Somalia was humiliated. Furious, Barre turned to the US, ditching his Soviet patrons but clinging to the socialist script. By the late 1980s, Somalia was falling apart. Siad Barre's authoritarian Marxist regime was losing control amid growing clan-based resistance and economic collapse. Civil war erupted, and on January 26, 1991, Barre fled Mogadishu. Notably, he escaped in a tank allegedly filled with reserves from the Somali central bank, including gold and foreign currency valued at $27 million. His fall marked the collapse of Somalia's Marxist experiment, leaving behind a failed state and a legacy of anarchy that has continued for decades. Barre later died in exile in Lagos, Nigeria in 1995.